continue standing, that's fine too. Good morning all, and welcome to our December Mitchell Institute Forum event. We've got the great pleasure of featuring the Air Force's newest Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Lieutenant General Mark Grace Kelly, and it's an honor to have him here. But before I introduce him, I think it is appropriate to take a moment to remember President H.W. Bush, his service to our nation as a naval aviator, member of Congress, ambassador to the United Nations, emissary to China, head of the CIA, vice president, and president, is a record equaled by few. Personally, I'll always be grateful for President Bush's leadership and faith in his military commanders during Operation Desert Storm. He was unique among modern presidents in that he provided strategic guidance and then empowered the military to achieve one of the most clear-cut victories in the history of modern warfare. And I dare say it's because he provided guidance, didn't micromanage, and let the military execute the strategy that he had laid out. It was not a preordained outcome. It came through leadership that started at the very top. And his legacy is one that should inspire us all. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce General Kelly. He recently completed a tour as commander of the 12th Air Force, and he just joined the Air Staff this fall. But I just had a chance to chat with him a little bit, and it sounds like he is fully ensconced and has been here for years. So you get in the routine and fit right into the fold. He spent the earlier portion of his career flying the F-15E, and also had an exchange tour, hardship tour, flying F-A-18s with the Royal Australian Air Force. Given the challenges currently on the Air Force's plate, the importance of policy options air power now accords the nation, his tenure as the A3 is going to be very much important. So Mark, we're looking forward to what you have to say and engaging with us. You've got a reasonably friendly audience. But it's a good audience, and we look forward to having you here and look forward to hearing what you have to say. So the podium is yours.
Well, thanks. I appreciate everybody taking time out of your day. And as General Deptula stated, this is definitely a day of reverence for a phenomenal leader of our nation. As all the things that General Deptula said, led our nation in different ways and forms and never stopped serving. Truly a life of service and a journey of purpose we should all, aspire to and recognize. So thanks again. It's great to be here today. They let us out of the Pentagon normally for an hour to walk the grounds. Today we're out a little bit longer in recognition of President Bush's service to his nation. And so, but the comments that I wanted to talk to you about today obviously are within my swim lane that General Deptula mentioned is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations of your great Air Force. Basically, how it serves the nation, and specifically want to discuss for a few minutes our Air Force readiness, Air Force competition, which isn't often discussed, and future Air Force operations out there. So for any discussion about Air Force readiness, Air Force relevance to the nation kind of starts and ends with our National Defense Strategy. Our National Defense Strategy is pretty much the why and the what of our military. This National Defense Strategy unambiguously articulates a return to an era of great power competition. It drives how we will organize, train, and equip and present ready and lethal fighting forces to conduct our operations to compete, deter, and to win. National Defense Strategy is clear recognition of this new era, an era where we can no longer deploy, assemble, and operate uncontested. We must recognize that every domain, every phase of any conflict will be contested. And contested is kind of a nice word under continuous attack in every domain. It's a recognition there's no sanctuary, not even our homeland. In the National Defense Strategy, we have to ensure homeland defense. We have to execute nuclear deterrence operations. We have to compete, deter, and win against a strategic peer adversary, handle a rogue regime, and counter violent extreme organizations. Your Air Force is key in all 5 of these requirements. So I'm going to take a quick minute to cover those in more detail. First and foremost, when we wake up every day, we have to defend the homeland. So while we're meeting here today, while the state funeral will take place in the National Cathedral, we have people sitting on alert, protecting the skies of our nation. There are a certain number of forces and squadrons that are required to defend the homeland. And we have to have the force that we can prepare and present to the NORTHCOM commander, General O'Shaughnessy, to defend the homeland. Second of all, we have to always have a safe and effective and secure nuclear deterrent. The Air Force owns 2 of the 3 legs of the nuclear triad, and by virtue, we own 75% of the nuclear command and control. So we have to get the president where he needs to be, when he needs to be, talking to who he needs to talk to at the right time in the right place. He has to stay connected to his leadership to make timely decisions and the forces in the field should he choose to execute. There is a force model in a number of squadrons, again, that we provide General Hyten to be able to accomplish that mission while we're also simultaneously defending the homeland. Third thing is National Defense Strategy says we have to have the forces prepared and ready to fight and win and defeat a peer adversary. And this is probably a good time. In lexicon that I work with daily, the term near peer isn't used very often. Frankly, we're looking at peer adversaries, and that's the best way for us to think about them. Less like Goliath, more like David every day. It's our pacing threats. Our strategy tells us we have to be prepared not only to deter and compete below the level of armed conflict, but if deterrence fails, to fight and to win. And that requires a certain new group of forces to do that. We have to expect that if we're in a peer fight, there's going to be an opportunistic middleweight power that's going to take advantage of that and take us on. We have to be able to also deter that power, and so there are forces we have prepared to present to do the business of deterrence if we're already engaged in a high-end fight. The fifth element of the National Defense Strategy is to make sure that we maintain campaign momentum against violent extremism. We all know that we've been in this fight for a lot of years, and we expect to be in it for a lot more years to come. The strategy is to drive down violence to a point it can be handled within the sovereign borders of governed nations, and that's going to be a long period of time. As I pivot off of the National Defense Strategy, the first thing that consumes my day and the last thing that I think of as I leave the Pentagon and the last thing I think of before I fall asleep is Air Force readiness to ensure we can execute these tasks as the National Defense Strategy and our leaders and our Air Force leaders have directed us to do. So with these obvious engagements and commitments actually throughout our history, during the years of the Korean Peninsula and the years of a fight in Vietnam and the 28 years since Desert Storm, your Air Force has been engaged in combat for over half of its 71-year existence. Along with our great service partners, your Air Force went to the Middle East 28 years ago in August of 1990, and we never left. Today, I have over 24,000 airmen deployed over 320 locations worldwide. Last year, airmen conducted 172,000 sorties and 98,000 precision airstrikes to support Iraqi and partner forces in Syria and Iraq. And 2 days ago, as I got my daily report, we're still over 100 weapons in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. You still have an Air Force that's in combat every single day like they were 28 years ago. This latest Middle East campaign of OIR in the last 17 of the previous 20 years, which also had us engaged in Afghanistan, has made us really, really good at training, deploying, and fighting in a permissive environment. But this operational tempo has come at a cost. It's wear and tear on our airmen, wear and tear on the families, wear and tear on our aircraft and equipment. It has resulted in fewer high-end, what we turn to really high-end training opportunities that our new National Defense Strategy requires. And while the U.S. has focused much energy on the Middle East and Afghanistan, appropriately so, over the last 20 years, our strategic adversaries have unambiguously focused on us, specifically competing and fighting across all domains and all phases of combat, including below armed conflict and competing in what we refer to as the global commons of international airspace, international water space, outer space, the Arctic, and cyberspace, where they selectively choose the rules of the nations that they will follow. To better compete in this new era of threats, the Air Force must build a more lethal and ready force. Again, the first priority of your Air Force's A3. Your Air Force needs trained professionals because that's the first order of business, to the tune of about 3,300 airmen over the next 5 years increase in our top line manpower. These efforts have already paid off in terms of manpower, specifically in our maintenance and sustainment professionals. But when you're talking about putting a wrench on a B-2, a Minuteman III, a C-17, F-22, it takes a bit of time to turn an apprentice into a technician. We're also addressing aviator shortages, and we just completed our most recent Aircrew Summit last week out at Andrews. We're increasing flying hours, increasing funding for our weapons system sustainment to accelerate aircraft depot and aircraft component depot, that's our parts, repair timelines. The sustainment of the supply chain enterprise is one of the hardest things a modern Air Force executes. And it's usually the first point of where a modern Air Force will fail. Your Air Force, or any Air Force, is not as strong as that which it owns. It's only as strong as that which it can sustain. I'm always amazed at the skill and professionalism of our uniformed and our civilian sustainment workforce every time I visit an Air Logistics Center and depot. To win a modern fight, our units that are assigned and who visit the European and Pacific theaters have to be prepared to fight tonight. And our units based in the U.S. must be ready to deploy tomorrow. Deploy forward, knowing that they'll mobilize, they'll pack up, they'll move forward, and they'll arrive under constant physical and cyber attack. Our ability to compete and win in high-end fight can only be achieved if we have commensurate training ranges, including threat emitters and our training adversary aircraft to replicate the threat and provide realistic training. For increased readiness, our units have to have the bandwidth, that means the time, and the opportunity to train together. Our 4th and our 5th generation fighters, our low observable and our non-low observable bombers, our cyber and our space forces, along with battlefield airmen, tankers, command and control, etc. This enterprise comes together in the high-end fight, so it has to come together before a high-end fight in our training ranges. And our ranges have to be able to replicate that threat. And not only do we have to train for the high-end fight across multiple disciplines within our Air Force, we have to do so with our other service partners, and we have to do so with our partners and allies around the globe. So again, one of the keys of executing the National Defense Strategy, and probably my biggest focus area, is the Air Force readiness and lethality as we engage around the globe. Pivoting off the NDS, and if you read the NDS, obviously the unclassified version is available for everybody, and frankly, it's a pretty darn good read. You'll see a continual reference to competition, which isn't normally engaged in daily lexicon all the time. But along with readiness, I think the other key concept of the NDS is this great power competition, specifically this competition word. The Air Force was born out of great power competition, coming out of World War II. It honed itself against peer adversaries throughout the Cold War. It's really challenging to narrowly discuss Air Force competition within the greater context of great power competition, as it's a small sliver of great power competition. In a Western military campaign, we tend to shape the environment in what we refer to as Phase 0. We deter in what we refer to as Phase 1. We seize the initiative in Phase 2. We dominate in Phase 3 major combat operations. We stabilize in Phase 4. And then we transition to civil authority in Phase 5. It is a Western world of finite war, and it's executed in a rules-based model, and distinctly transitions from a peace to war to peace construct. However, in a Sun Tzu or a Maoist kind of revolutionary theory, a perspective of war, it's an infinite struggle. And in an infinite struggle, it's long-term competition, which you'll see laced through our national defense strategy. There are a couple key reasons why this competition thing is important. A, it's written into our national defense strategy. 2, in the compete, deter, and win spectrum, the U.S. is really, really good at the deter and the win categories. Competition below the threshold of major combat ops is primarily where our strategic peer adversaries are executing their national and their military strategies. China didn't seize and militarize the South China Sea in Phase 3 major combat ops. They did in what we would call Phase 0-1, short of war, some people refer to as gray zone competition. Or they did in what they would consider the whole of nation campaign. The Russians didn't seize the Crimea. They didn't chemically poison on the soil of our closest allies or establish bases in Syria in Phase 3 major combat operations. They did these things what we would consider phase 01, short of war gains. You don't have to look much too past the boat events lately in the Sea of Oshkosh to see what that phase 01 competition, seizing short gains, looks like. Nested underneath this global competition and military competition is kind of like what does this look like? What does this Air Force competition look like? Well, frankly, it's employing our Air Force more dynamically, Air Force capabilities showing up at different locations at different times without notice, executing with our allies and partners on discrete timelines. Operating in a place and domain of our choosing, it's utilizing our technical advances of our Air Force to force a strategic adversary to react to us. What does this Air Force competition look like in 2019 to 2030? It's tough in the time that we have today, and it's really tough in an unclassified environment to describe what space and cyber competition looks like. But if you look at competition in the air domain, where we utilize our technical advantage to operate in a time and place of our choosing that an adversary must react to, it's easier to imagine. It looks like an SR-71 years back that we all remember when some of us came in the Air Force. Along with this competition piece, another effort we work on daily is what we call Expeditionary Air Force operations, which has come and gone through chapters of the Air Force. We've been more and less expeditionary. But the requirements of future warfare demands a new way of fighting, as our peer competitors are not going to allow us to formate, move forward, pack up, travel to the airport, and set up our operations uncontested. Every phase and every domain we expect to be contested. So we're going to have to establish a base, defend a base, receive and integrate follow-on forces, establish the command and control, take a fight forward in a contested environment where losses are expected, and then fight that base. As we organize, train, and equip for this, first we need expeditionary leaders, ones who can operate on the combat frontier, those who know they'll be cut off from communication lines and who are potentially cut off from supply lines. We'll need to evolve from a force provider that provides parts and pieces of a warfighting capability to self-deploying, self-sustaining, self-defending expeditionary fighting forces. Our air crew in Europe and those who will visit and deploy forward will learn quickly to look less on the Autobahn as a really cool place to drive, an exciting place to drive, and more of a viable place to land, rearm, and refuel. So again, thanks for your time. I'm really more interested in your questions. Thanks for your support to the United States Air Force. We work hard every day to serve this great nation, to be more ready, more lethal, and more expeditionary. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Sir, thanks very much. For question and answers, if you could please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself, name and affiliation. First one. Sure.
Yes, sir. David Isby, Air International. Secretary Mattis's recent setting of a goal of raising mission availability rates for fighter aircraft, especially with the F-22 and F-35 aircraft. How is the Air Force looking to meet this goal in the time frame set?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, the good news, the great news about Secretary Mattis is you don't have to wonder what he's thinking. He's going to tell you. And he gives pretty unambiguous, what we refer to as commander intent of what's going on. So the 80% mission capable rate falls within my great partner who lives next door to me on Bowling, Lieutenant General Warren Berry. But I work closely with him because as you start to raise the mission capable rate of the aircraft, frankly, there's an easy way to do that. You stop flying them. But it's not a viable way to raise the mission capable rate. We have to keep our forces ready as we get our aircraft more ready. So the lines of effort that Lieutenant General Berry and the other sustainment pros I kind of referred to earlier comes across many lines. One is flight line maintenance. And as I mentioned earlier, we've taken a 4,000 maintainer shortage, and it's going to be zero by the time we get to the first day of 2019. Those technicians will take a while to season, but the manpower is greatly needed, and it will greatly help in our what we call our M rate, and that's our aircraft that are down awaiting maintenance. The other driver that keeps us from being at 80% is a S rate. It's a supply rate, and as referenced before, we've put in resourcing to our depots, not only our major depots that do airframe maintenance, but our supply depots. And frankly, my concern is with those supply depots, is having the parts we need, because especially as you reference like an F-22, If we don't have a part to fix an airplane, sometimes we actually have to take a knife and cut into the low observable coating of that to access a part. That is the most inefficient way to get the part, but if we have to get it, we'll get it. It usually takes about 6 to 7 amount of time of hours, man hours, to get that part than just to go to get it off the shelf. And so we're putting funding in our supply chain, we're working manpower in our maintenance chain, and then we're actually looking what Joan Barry's looked at. As a matter of fact, he's not in town because what he's doing is he's getting with industry, and specifically some of our airline partners, where they have sensors in their aircraft that show fatigue and show where maintenance needs to take place, instead of us taking it back and ripping out the skin and trying to look for it like a CSI event. You know, they actually tell you from inside with technology. And so they're working hard on those events. They're actually making pretty darn good progress. And if you look at those 3 airframes across the enterprise, the Air Force standard, which before Secretary Mattis gave us the go-do, the Air Force standard for F-16 maintenance was 81% already. And we're operating pretty close to that before his directive. The low observable platforms, by definition of being low observable, are a little bit more maintenance out there, but our team's working hard on that. Okay, good question.
Hi, I'm Pat Hose from Janes. For improving your ranges, what types of sensors do you want to improve, modernize, or add?
Yeah, Pat, good question. So the key in your question is, what do I want? You know, and there's a difference between what I want and what I need. So what I want is the actual threats. You know, it's kind of hard to go onto eBay and buy an S-300. If I could and I had the money, I would, and I'd put them out there. It's kind of hard to go out and buy a Su-57. If I could, I would, and I'd put them out there. And I'd let our forces go out and fly against exactly the threat they have. That's not attached to reality. That's unhinged from reality, so we have to be hinged with resource and availability reality so we get the best threat emitters and the threat ranges we can. We have a lot of range space in the United States, and frankly, every day that range space becomes more and more of a national treasure. We don't have enough resources to make every range what I'd call a 5th generation range. As an Air Force migrates from a 3rd generation to a 4th generation to a 5th generation Air Force, if you don't migrate your mindset, your maintainers, and your ranges and everything else with it along at the same time, you're only as good as the generation you're locked to, which means I need to have 5th generation ranges. We don't have resources to make every range a 5th generation range. I do have enough resources to make the Nellis and the J Park up in Alaska a 5th generation range. And so we'll take the emitters we have, the ones we can acquire, and the adversary training aircraft we can, and pretty much focus them mostly on those ranges. Also, they have to be good size. 5th generation airplane eats up lots of airspace. Lots of airspace.
Why does it eat up so much more airspace?
Because if you go back in history to World War I, engagement took place only as far as I could see. You know, if you go to an engagement of tomorrow, engagement will take place as far as I can see. Sensors that our industry partners are building for us can see pretty darn good ways. And so the engagements and the training and the maneuvering and setting up our formations has to take place at further and further ranges. So it just eats up a lot of range space. That's a very simplified answer, but that's a short one. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, sir. Wes Morgan with
Hi, Russ.
Politico. We've heard a lot in the past few months about assets shifting from the CENTCOM area of operations over to EUCOM and PACOM to meet the needs of the National Defense Strategy. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit from an Air Force perspective about what assets have shifted and in what kinds of quantities?
Yeah. I'll give you easy, no, I can't talk about those assets that shifted. So, but I can talk, just like I chatted earlier, about National Defense Strategy. And the National Defense Strategy unambiguously directs us to regain readiness for a high-end fight. And so the forces and the airmen that we have every single day, as I referenced, doing our nation's bidding in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, are still doing that as we sit right here. But it's all about striking a balance with helping our weapon system sustainment, striking a balance with getting training, striking a balance without abandoning the young soldier who's out in the field right now south of Kandahar. So to that end, we're trying to rebalance a little bit, and I mean a little bit. So I'd say it's on the margins, and I probably think it's an overstatement or a misstatement on the blogosphere to say that we're shifting forces to Europe and Pacific. If you see any forces shift, it'll be probably on the margins. Very light numbers, probably coming back home to gain a few more days here and there. And literally it is few forces, few days, back at home, gaining some training. But if I can have a unit home one more week than they were last year, that's one more event they can go with the family. That's one more high-end training event they can do on one of the high-end ranges. And it's one more day they can actually work on some building sustainment enterprise in there. So it's really more on the margins right now. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. In the ISR realm, has the amount of ISR in the CENTCOM AOR doing around campus serious stuff remained constant?
The amount of ISR that's in any of our COCOMs has never met the demand. It wasn't meeting the demand last year, it's not meeting the demand yesterday, and it won't meet the demand 6 months from now, just because there's an insatiable amount of information that our commanders need to make command-level decisions. They have an adequate amount of ISR to execute the missions that they're given. Part of that is because of a little bit of the slowdown in the Iraq-Syria fight.
Thank you for joining us, General. My name is Mike Slunski from Avison. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk Air Force readiness. I was wondering if you could speak to the demand for contracted air support and contracted air forces, and with the upcoming competition coming up, whether or not the Air Force will be able to scale to that demand.
No, good question. And so you're specifically talking about the adversary air contracts? Yeah. So with the force size we have now, you know, our high-end platforms, you know, our 5th gen, or for that matter, our 4th gen airplanes need sparring partners out there in the air. So that's going to come from one of two sources. Either we're going to self-generate from other blue Air Force forces. It may come from our Navy partners, but frankly, they have the same challenges we do. A much better opportunity for our aviators is to train against a contract sparring partner. As far as can we scale, I think the Air Force can scale. I think the real question is, will there be enough industry supply to meet the military demand, and will it be in the right construct? Just like I mentioned, 5th gen ranges eat up a lot of range space. 5th gen platforms kill a lot of adversaries, and I need the highest end adversary I can get. In a perfect world, it's got a good radar on the nose, and in a perfect world, it's got a jammer strapped to it in some way, shape, or form, hopefully a high-end jammer, and it can move outside of 1.4 Mach. That's a good question. I think tough for me to see in this current construct outside of the 5 to 10 year time frame, and right now it's the most viable solution I see for the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
Sir, thank you for being here.
Hi.
Rod Atkins with Deloitte Consulting. On the civilian side, society is increasingly becoming more comfortable with the digital revolution and allowing decision support from advanced artificial intelligence, robots feeding their pets and vacuuming their homes. How far do you see the digital airmen in terms of providing decision support to folks like you and other senior leaders out in the COCOMs, and how ubiquitous will that be in the Air Force?
Really good question. And so, I mean, this is just the biggest growth industry we have is in the information space. And so, you know, we're not that great at predicting the next fight, but I can tell you the next one's going to be the most contested and congested in terms of electromagnetic spectrum that's out there. I would call it exponentiated chaos. And the team that will win is the one that can cut through that exponentiated chaos and get to decision quality information through the entire electromagnetic spectrum. If you mapped out the electromagnetic spectrum from the 1 kilohertz all the way up to the biggest gig, there is not a bandwidth in the electromagnetic spectrum that our adversaries aren't targeting. So we have to have airmen, to your question, we have to have airmen that can cut through that and find ground truth amidst this exponentiated chaos. It'll be a high-end fight. Yeah.
Sir, I'm Steve Traver from Congressman Pierce's office. I'm particularly interested in what you said about ranges and our international commitments. So I'm going to ask you to just drop back a few decades to when you were an Aussie pilot. And what I'm particularly interested in is when you talk about us having our 5th gen ranges, we're hearing that things are not looking good for the future of ranges with some of our allies, that they're in an even tougher spot than we are. And just off the top of your head, is there anything we can do to help them train to the level that we're planning to train to in a coalition fight before we actually have to do it?
Perfect. I couldn't have planted that question any better, and I haven't met Steve before. Short answer is yes. One is make sure, and this is really more for me, less for you, sir. Biggest thing for me is to make sure we have a lot of discipline in our scheduling. And so, for example, I still know a lot of my Australian partners. I stay in touch with them, frankly, just because they're good friends. But the other reason is they're good allies. And we, the U.S., and specifically the United States Air Force, is the leader and the center of excellence for all things 5th gen. And along the way, we have to admit we've made some mistakes. And heaven help us if we let our Navy, our Marines, and our closest treaty allies make the same mistakes we made. So we owe it to them to give them our lessons learned. And part of that lesson learned, and Air Vice Marshal Kitcher, my good friend, who's leading some of that, I just visited and I had dinner with him, and I articulated this 5th gen range space piece to him. Like, if you don't grow your ranges at the pace you grow your 5th gen force, you're only going to be limited by your ranges out there. You know, when, 30 years ago, when we took off in a 4th gen or 3rd gen airplane, you drove to the range and you would execute your, mission. Today, we have F-35 scheduled to go in at Eielson. I'd have to look up the exact timeline, but it's in the next, months, not years out. When those airplanes take off, and frankly, before they take off, when they're taxiing out, they will get from the network the feeds of what emitters are up and what emitters are not, what adversary air is up and what adversary air is not. And that's key, taxiing out, to know what fight you're taking off into. And as soon as that airplane takes off and as soon as the nose gear door shuts, it starts contributing to that network. If you don't have a network to fight against, you can't use a network-centric fighter. And that's key to our allies and partners. So until they get their range space, the best thing I can do is advocate to them, what I recommend as a friend and a partner. But until then, the best thing I can do from my seat is make sure we offer them the opportunity, the time slots, and the visibility. For example, Red Flag Alaska, what I particularly had dinner and talked to them about, I said, hey, you need to take a look at our Red Flag Alaska schedule when your F-35s come online, and we need to work with you. Same thing would be for the Brits or any other treaty ally, and come over and train with us. Because the other thing is, besides seeing our range space, we don't just need our F-35s and other aircraft talking to each other. We need to talk to our allies and partners on this network, because it is a network fight. Yeah. Does that answer your question, sir? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm Doug Greenlaw from Research Innovations, and kind of following up the last two questions, how is the Air Force introducing modern information and cyber domain into the C2 process?
General Goldfein, one of his big rocks is our multi-domain command and control effort. And I'm glad every day that we have the smart people that need to work on this working on it. It is a big challenge. And so the biggest thing we're working on in terms of introducing modern, cyber into it is trying to get out of a single domain centric C2 model. Because the fight will take place, a modern fight will take place across all domains, literally at a split second. It'll traverse one domain to another. And so we have to be able to fight across those domains. We got to make sure that a air operations center can connect end-to-end to a naval operations center, can connect end-to-end to a land operations center, and stop being a a kind of a stovepipe of domain command and control. That's probably the biggest way. And the other way is what I referenced earlier, and that is our C2 systems have to be resilient. And if we can't lose one node and not have a natural automatic workaround take place almost to where we don't even see it. We see it to go repair, but we don't see it in the degradation of our systems. Over the last, 30 years, our airmen, our Air Force, and frankly, all of our service partners have gotten used to a couple things. One of them is pristine C2. We have to have commanders, we have to have airmen that assume that every single leg of that C2 system will be challenged, and they have to be able to operate losing it. We've also gotten used to operating with fairly low casualties, and we have to make sure mentally and physically in our medical capability we're ready to respond to that. The medical capability, I know, is a long separation away from your question on cyber. We have to be able to work around these challenges. That's probably the biggest thing of cyber. You know, our adversaries know the level of dependency we have. Yeah.
Please.
Hi, Steve Losi, Air Force Times.
Hey, Steve.
Sir, I'd like to follow up on the discussion about the 80% directive, specifically the manpower side of it. When I hear from maintainers in the field, there's a sense that they're already working 12-hour plus shifts. Weekend shifts are very common. What strategy is the Air Force taking to handle the manpower side to accomplish this goal without pushing the workforce harder than they're able to bear?
And no, really good question, Steve. As I mentioned before, we don't necessarily spike the ball in the end zone because we've taken the manpower shortage from 4,000 to 0. It is a big accomplishment, but everybody in here knows that when you bring on, 4,000 apprentices, you actually you created more of a burden. It's a good problem to have, but we still have to take these apprentices and turn them into technicians. So in other words, we put most of our technicians through at Shepherd Air Force Base, and if you walk that campus, literally campus of that Air Force Base, it is unbelievable to see just the sheer amount of humanity walking those hangars and walking from airplane to airplane. So the short answer is we have tried to recruit and grow our way out of this, and now we're at the chapter we have to train our way out of this problem. But if we recruit and grow and train our way, and we end up working these people, so hard, especially the instructors, and the 7 to 9 levels on the flight line, the 7 to 9 levels in the back shops, and in the depots, to the point where they have to choose the service above self as to turn into something service above that which they hold higher than themselves, which I would say is at least their family and their fitness, then we've got a problem. And so it's like anything else, it's a balance. And so we stay in touch with them. Digging down a little bit into that, one of the bigger challenges I have is on what I call specific MDS, specific weapon systems, and I'll give you one example that may articulate that. So the Air Force of 30 years ago, had F-16 wings across the continental United States, whether it be Hill, whether it be Pope, whether it be Moody, the case may be. We now have one, single, at Shaw. So so there's some personnel things. I'm working with the other smarter version of Lieutenant General Kelly, they won. Some things I'm working with him, because right now a 3-level F-16 crew chief, there's some restrictions to overseas assignments. We're careful about sending, a 20-year-old 3-level that hasn't been hardly away from home up to near Fairbanks, Alaska to work at Eielson, So we usually vector them, a whole lot of percentage of them go to Shaw. Well, if Shaw there receives all of our 3 levels, and as soon as they turn into 5 levels and they farm out, to the overseas bases, that's an incredible burden on Team Shaw. And so I try not to get into the weeds, but frankly, it's the weeds and those indicators that are the biggest indicators and challenges that we have. Oh, by the way, that maintainer challenge of Shaw, it's also an operator challenge of Shaw. They will get a lot of lieutenants and a lot of folks right out of the formal training, and as soon as they're remotely experienced, we'll send them out to the Kunsans, Osans, and Spangdalams of the world. And so I got to make sure that I take care of Team Shaw and other islands like that, and make sure we don't turn them into kind of an airman puppy mill and end up just sending folks out around the globe. That's a tough bill. Yeah, sure.
Are maintenance shops going to have to just deal with longer hours for the next, quarter or 3/4 of a year or so until this 80% deadline is met? Is this just going to have to be a fact of life that maintenance shops are going to deal with longer hours?
In my 32 years, they've dealt with longer hours for 32 years, and so I would be remiss to say that that's going to change in the next year.
Sir, Blaise Durrani. Fast question. You talked about the maintenance shortages. What about the pilot shortages, especially on the tankers and other areas? Could you give us some insight of where we're going?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, that's the other thing that kind of takes part of my day. We just did our aircrew summit last week. So there are some things that are within Air Force control, and there's some things that are not. We cannot influence airline hiring. And if you look historically over the last 30, 50 years and look at retention versus hiring, it's a pretty clear context of how those affect each other. And so what we can influence is the quality of service, quality of life, quality of work that they have. So to that end, we've worked a lot. I hate to say on the margins, but we've worked where we can. One of the bigger frustrations of our aviators is the amount of additional duties they execute. So we've put contractors into squadrons to take those additional duties off their plate. We've bumped up flying hours, not necessarily to increase morale, but frankly increase readiness. And when you increase readiness, go find high readiness, you'll find high morale. And we've done other efforts like that. We've bumped up bonus amounts to keep folks in. Usually our folks don't join for the sake of money, and they usually don't stay for money. But we have to work in the parameters we have to keep them. This is the first year in the last, I want to say 5 years, to where we're holding steady. In other words, we haven't powered our way out of this, but we've stopped the decline. We actually had a higher bonus take rate, and bonus take rate isn't exactly a one-to-one indicator of aviator retention, but it's a strong indicator. And it's the first year in 5 years it's actually gone up. Yeah. Hard problem. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Brett McCoy with LinkedIn. Kind of doubling down on this recruiting side of things. With the pool of talent propensity to serve shrinking, are you making adjustments operationally to potentially widen that pool, either with older people or different skill sets?
Are you looking for a job? No. If we're widening the pool, if widening the pool means lowering our standards, the answer is no. Because that's a fast way to any industry's demise, is to lower your standards out there. So are we considering, like you said, return to service? We've done some return to service of folks who were in the Air Force, served the nation proudly for 20 years, decide they wanted to go do something different. When they would go do something different, it wasn't as satisfying. We're trying to make it easier for them to come back and serve their nation, and we need their expertise. In rated fields, frankly, in almost every field. You have 20 years experience, we wouldn't be very smart for us to turn away just because you're collecting a retirement check. We're trying to facilitate that to come back in. As mentioned in the question earlier, I've had discussions, and it's just discussions. If you look at our other partners around the globe, for example, the Royal Australian Air Force is the question referenced earlier, they make it pretty easy to exit the Air Force for a few years and then come back in. They've had an air chief, Air Marshal Jeff Brown got out of the Royal Australian Air Force, sold real estate for a few years and came back in, became their air chief. That's not a model we've adopted, but we can't take anything off the table. We need to let people adjust and have a gap year for life events, because life happens, whether it be with our kids or with our parents, or the case may be. But in terms of opening the recruiting pool, a method to open the recruiting pool, lowering the standards, that is not a path that we are on. I'd have to bring up the smarter Lieutenant General Kelly to answer that question, but I can get back to you, though. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Kelly, I'm Pops Allgood, Alexandria, Virginia.
Hi.
I'm not very good at math in public, but I listened to you, increased flying hour program. As I understand it, we're going from about 1,100 pilot production to somewhere around 1,500.
Yes, sir.
Over the next few years or so. And we want to keep that 80% plus MC rate, I think. So that's a pretty square corner there. There must be some significant force structure increases. How do you sustain something like that? 1,100 to 1,500, and then you apply the retention TARs and that sort of thing. That's a big dry biscuit to swallow, right?
It is. So across the spectrum, specifically on aircrew, if I get to your question, sir, across the spectrum of aircrew, bringing them in from the Air Force Academy or any commissioning source all the way to retaining, my highly valued instructor pilots. You know, we have to work across every one of those stages, and so just for a minute, I'll kind of walk you down that stage. We have to increase our production, but we also have to be, we can't be naive to the impact of that. You know, if there's a traffic problem getting to downtown DC, adding 7 lanes of concrete out of Stafford's not going to fix that, you know. I have to work along the entire ecosystem of the aviator production, retention, absorption piece. Frankly, the main phases of the aviator lifespan, the ecosystem, are the production, and the production goes all the way to a formal training unit, learn how to fly a C-17 or an F-15 or whatever the case may be. My biggest pinch, in other words, where the construction is happening on 395 in my world, is frankly in the absorption. And that's taking an aviator who's qualified to take off and land and do some basic skills in whatever their airframe may be, and taking them from qualified to fly to qualified to fight or qualified to execute that mission, and then getting them into the squadron. That absorption piece is the tightest part. I'll go back since I started talking about F-16s and maintainers. I'll go back to that. So when I went out to the Air Force Academy in June, I had a young lieutenant, name was Tony Scott. He was my escort officer, and his job was to make sure I didn't get lost. He did great. You know, I didn't get lost the whole 2 days. But the reason he was there was not a great reason. He was waiting to go to pilot training. So Tony Scott graduated from the United States Air Force Academy in May of 2018. He's going to start pilot training at Shepherd Air Force Base in April of 19. That's as fast as I can get him there because of the jam up. Pilot training will take a year, so I'll get him out of pilot training around May of 20. He wants to go fly an F-16. I hope he gets to do so. The wait for him to leave pilot training and go through introduction of fighter fundamentals and then go to F-16 training someplace like Holloman is 8.3 months. He'll then go to someplace like Kunsan or Shaw, and because the experience rate in that airframe is right now running around 38%, which is not healthy. That means for every young guy or gal, I've got one experienced person to lead them, you know, every 3 of them, if you would. It'll take longer for him to become mission ready. So 4 years after he graduates from the United States Air Force Academy, he'll be mission ready. 4 years. There's some parts I can do to work on the margins, and our team is working really, really hard on those margins to make sure he doesn't have one more day, we refer to as BIT, break-in training, that he needs to. And that's a full court press. I need to have a lieutenant that's ready to fight, not a captain. You know, and so we aggressively work that part. But to your other part of the 80% mission capable rate, getting back to that slot of absorption where we absorb him or her, the only way I'm going to be able to absorb him is if I have enough iron on the line to do that. And so to say that this is not a trivial challenge, it takes a whole lot of sustainment pros and operator pros. It's an understatement. It's what we engage every single day. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's a big haul.
Well, it's a hard question, and you talk about a 25% increase in production.
Yeah.
Increase in force structure to accommodate that, and/or U rates, MC rates that are up higher, so that you can get.
Yes, sir.
Morning, sir. Dr. Steve Burgess, Air Work College. So what does the global integrated operating concept mean for the U.S. Air Force?
Yeah, what they call the GOM, the Global Operating Model. And so in the years past, you know, we would have units, and it's not necessarily a fighter unit or a bomber unit, or it's aircraft agnostic. We would have units, and if you chatted with those units and their commanders and said, where is your responsibility? You know, some would say, well, my responsibility is the Pacific. Well, if you're living in the Pacific, that's okay. But we would have units in the continental United States that says, you know, for years, I'll give you an example. For years, we rotated the B-1s almost exclusively into IUD, you know, to do our AFCENT mission. They didn't do a lot of rotations into the EUCOM and the PACOM theater. We need them to think, you know, because our strategic adversaries are around the globe. We need them to think more on a global scale, and the only way for us to do that is to have them dynamically go in a little bit more unpredictable rate to those different theaters. So they're familiar with it. It's not their fault. If all we do is send a unit back and forth to the same location, we can't blame them for only knowing that theater. We own that, I own that, to keep them familiar with the Pacific and the European theater and, you know, the Middle East theater as we do our nation's bidding. Yeah. Good question. I can hear you.
Hello, I'm Janessa Simler from Boeing. So, in light of the challenges that you've described from our peer competition and the steps that you're taking to increase readiness, both material readiness as well as the readiness of our personnel and our forces, this is kind of a follow-on to an earlier question. Obviously, that comes with a big bill associated with it. And so with a fixed or shrinking top line, where is the Air Force now considering where it can take risk in order to increase readiness and lethality?
No, that's a good question. I mean, the good news every day is we've got some great professionals in your Air Force A8 and your acquisition pros that work every day with how we get the most out of every tax dollar, and we get it faster. We have to acquire at the speed of relevance. To your question, where do we take risk? The NDS is pretty unambiguous in that, is we won't take risk in a high-end fight. Does that trigger a follow-on question? We would not take risk in the high-end fight. So that means we'll take it everywhere else but that. And so, yeah, it goes to the point. It kind of goes to the earlier question of global operating model. You know, and you heard the secretary's, or you read the secretary's speech of the Air Force we need. You know, and I think Joan Deptula has left, but you know, he made reference back to President Bush 41, which is appropriate for today. But when you take a step back from that in a geostrategic context, which frankly is a little bit outside the realm of the A3, but it's what we all live in. But when you take a look at that, what, you know, General Deptula, when he was Lieutenant Colonel Deptula, got to help do the force design of engaging a second-rate power with a force designed to engage a global peer competitor. We need to make sure we don't engage a global peer competitor with a force that's optimized for a VEO fight. And that's what I get to deal with every day. And so while you're A8 and while you're AQ folks, and be proud that they're there and not me, because they're smarter, get to deal with how much Air Force can the nation afford, I don't necessarily work in that realm, but my job is to make sure we don't learn how much it costs to lose. Because I can tell you how much it costs to lose. You know, if you go back in history, you know, the French lost their nation in 42 days, essentially with their Army, Navy, and Air Force intact. And they lost it because of this exponentiated chaos, even back those years, that was too hard to handle. That exponentiated chaos is 20 times what the today is 20 times what the exponentiated chaos was coming across, you know, Belgium.
So from your perspective, not taking risk in a high-end fight would also include not taking risk in how you get to the high-end fight and how your supply lines are.
True. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Good morning, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Orgeron, Air Force Fellow, currently with the Center for New American Security and light gray Eagle driver.
Awesome.
Question, I'd like to hear your thoughts on fourth generation fighter recapitalization, sustainment, and to meet the national defense strategy, the fourth, fifth gen fighter mix that the force needs moving forward.
Yeah, no, really good question. And again, something that's in every discussion we have. You know, whether it be today, what our mix is today, to what our mix will be in 2030 and beyond. And so our acquisition timelines and again, the Air Force we need as articulated by the Secretary and the Chief, you know, spells out quite a bit what we need in terms of requirements to fight a peer competitor in the 2030 timeframe. Can the Air Force afford 100% fifth generation force? Probably not. And if they could afford to buy it, they probably couldn't afford to sustain it in terms of manpower and other things like that. Would it be nice to have? It'd be awesome to have. You know, as we referenced the President Bush, who we're recognizing today, you know, he epitomized peace through strength, and nothing is stronger. And if you looked at the photos that came out of Hill Air Force Base of watching 30-some F-35s taxi down the runway and then take off, you know, I guarantee you, if you're a peer competitor, that ought to wake you up, you know, because that's coming at you, and that's a pretty tough, you know, challenge to get at. To your question of what is the right mix, it's not only a mix of 4th and 5th gen, because that's kind of a narrow question, which is not an invalid question, but a better question that consumes us all is 4th gen to 5th gen mix, fighter to bomber mix, airframe to cyber mix, cyber to space mix, and so on and so forth. So not that I'm not trying to trivialize your question. It's probably too hard to answer here and in an unclassified environment. But it is a bigger, nuanced part of what's our entire force structure going to look like. And our folks are working on that right now. And we're going to have just as much Air Force at every dollar combined. Yeah.
Got time for one more? Steve?
Actually, just all the discussion of personnel and getting the right mix of people. The next question is there anything we can do to help you with regard to how you factor the Guard and Reserve into that?
As far as how we factor in the Guard and Reserve, and that is probably the biggest recognition both in and outside the service, is that they're an equal partner in this effort. You know, we have our Guard and Reserve for a handful of reasons. One is we can't do our job without them. And they often have the most experienced maintainers, the most experienced aviators, sometimes the more ready airframes than our active duty counterparts, just because of that experience level. So we have to have opportunities. So sometimes our airmen are on active duty. They want to keep serving, but they can't keep serving in the active duty regimen and lifestyle. We have to keep opportunities for them. And so it's probably just to articulate how important the legs of our total force are. Every day we operate, there are thousands and thousands of guardsmen and reservists out doing our nation's business. And so that's probably the best compliment I've heard and seen is when I would walk the grounds of Bagram when I was a wing commander there, and there's 4 airmen, except if I had a 55-year-old staff sergeant, you know, you wouldn't know who's Guard, who's Reserve, who's active. It's really who cares. It's probably just more of a recognition of how they operate everything from up to our highest end fight with us shoulder to shoulder and supporting them in their endeavors. And the employers out there accommodating, as most of them do, that lifestyle of serving their nation. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Sir, on behalf of all of us at Mitchell, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.